Yeah, we have this trucking dispute that's been ongoing for 15 years. The U.S. under NAFTA is supposed to open its borders to Mexican trucks for ground transportation of international goods. The date for the opening of the borders came and went under the Clinton administration, and the borders never opened. Under the second President Bush, he instituted a pilot program in which a limited number of trucks were allowed across the border. But when President Obama was elected last February, Congress cut the funding to that program, and we haven't seen Mexican trucks in the U.S. since then.
Beyond the Teamsters, whose members are driving trucks on American roads, who's objecting to Mexican trucks and truck drivers, and why?
There are consumer groups that are concerned about the safety of Mexican trucks on U.S. highways. There are also smaller unions of truck drivers other than the Teamsters that are concerned about job loss and competition because the wages in the U.S. are so much higher than the wages that Mexican truck drivers are paid. But I think that the job competition argument is a little bit of a ruse because the Mexican trucks are only allowed to carry international goods. So they're only here for one purpose. They're not staying here to compete with domestic carriers.
So they go back empty
No, they
go back
carry,
with American goods
correct.
to Mexico? Okay.
They carry goods to and from, but they're not staying here to compete with in the domestic market.
But right now, those loads get transferred at the border and driven by an American truck driver to
Correct.
Chicago or New York or San Francisco.
Which increases the cost of the products eventually and hurts American consumers.
It's an estimated $739 million a year to Mexican fleets to transfer these goods, and that's passed on to U.S. consumers.
Isn't there also muttering among people like members of Congress about safety and Mexican inspection regimes for their trucks and that kind of thing? That while the Interstate Commerce Commission regulates what happens on American roads with American trucks, it can't reach over the border. Every time this argument comes up, I hear something about safety. Is that a fake or what is that?
That's the new banner of protectionism all over the place. If you look at the safety statistics of Mexican truck drivers in the United States, they actually have a better record than their American peers, which shows that the safety concern is unfounded.
But does that become sort of a symbol of the unfulfilled promise of NAFTA, that even though this treaty regime was meant to, in many ways, erase the borders between the three countries, those borders are still very, very much in existence?
The problem is that when you have a free trade agreement, and I say free trade quote unquote because a free trade agreement will only be one sentence and saying like all chips and goods and services can be traded freely between both countries, period. When you have a free trade agreement, it's like a phone book, like 20 phone books. Then you have regulated trade, and then you have a lot of room for disputes, a lot of room for controversies like the one of the Mexican truck drivers. I think that overall CAFTA has been an enormous improvement over the situation in both countries, Mexico and the United States and Canada also. Investment has been coming to Mexico as never before. Jobs have been created in Mexico despite all the bottlenecks that we were talking about before, the infrastructure, lack of investment, and foreign direct investment has been flowing into Mexico and jobs have been created. And the Mexican economy is stable now, despite the contraction last year because of the global downturn, because of the swine flu, because of the drug war violence. The Mexican economy is not experiencing those upswings that we saw 15 years ago, before NAFTA was implemented. So I think that overall the record is quite good. However, there's a lot of room for improvement as long as all these other regulations and restrictions on free trade remain in place.
Maureen, record quite good?
I would say that NAFTA has fulfilled the desire to increase goods, services, and investment, but it really hasn't had a good impact of what was promised in terms of improving the quality of life of Mexican population. I think in terms of job creation, some jobs have been created, but a lot of jobs have been lost between the rural sector and, as I said before, competing with U.S. subsidized agricultural products, particularly corn, beans, et cetera, to small and medium producers in Mexico, these small, medium businesses that have been really affected by the way NAFTA laws are. And I think that's the issue here in terms of an investment, is that the way NAFTA was negotiated, and I think we're seeing some of the restrictions on it now, puts Mexico in a really difficult situation of what can you do to improve a lot of things. They can't require foreign direct investment to have national content in the products that are made. You can't require them to have technological transfers or have a certain amount of Mexican employees. So what you have is these enclave economies where you have a lot of goods coming from the United States, produced in Mexico, back to the United States or exported other places that aren't really having an impact in increasing Mexico's economic
It's just hands
growth.
putting them together.
So growth rates in Mexico haven't been economically very high compared to a lot of other countries in Latin America since NAFTA was approved.
Well, if you and I, Francisco, went to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, I don't think we'd have much trouble finding people who think that NAFTA was a bad deal for the United States. But what do Mexicans think about it?
Well, at least the U.S. citizens in what came to be known as the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Ohio, they had compensation. The federal government actually, put funds in place to retrain people, to get them into new jobs. That was something that, in theory, was planned in Mexico. That the transition was, in theory, planned for. But then, boom, 94, 95, the Mexican economy implodes. The country suffers its worst financial and economic crisis since the 1930s. You see a big decrease in economic activity in the country, and many of those potentially good programs to compensate for many of the losers in the opening up of trade, particularly, as Maureen reminded us, in the agricultural sector, they just didn't get anything. Their only alternative was either to migrate to the border, and here you also have unintended consequences. The big agglomeration of people coming into cities like Tijuana, Nuevo Laredo, Matamoros, and most prominently Ciudad Juarez, cities which suddenly, used to have 300,000-400,000 inhabitants, and suddenly became proper metropolis with 1.5-2 million people without proper social services, police forces. Given that the type of re-exports that Mexico is engaged in, textiles, apparel, some electronics, this, from the economist perspective, is very good because demand and supply kind of react to each other very quickly. If there's a recession in the US, as was the case between 2000 and 2002, many of those shops in Mexico just shut down their doors. That was good for the producers because they were not inefficient. The other side of the coin is, and the workers. So this flexibility, which is good for economic efficiency, is not good at all for lifestyle, for being able to have, a reliable wage that feeds the family.
Right.